Ladies and gentlemen, welcome. It gives me great pleasure, and please join me in a rapturous cavalcade of applause to introduce Open UK CEO Amanda Brock.
Good morning, London. Are you feeling hot right now? Well, I'll tell you what, open source is hot right now. But I'll promise you that nobody who walks on any stage at this conference is in it because it's hot right now. We're in it for the long haul. And there's been a lot of spin about a win. And there's no doubting that open source today has won. But we've got a long way to go. So, as Andy said, I'm Amanda Brock. I'm the CEO of Open UK. And I'd like to start by welcoming you on behalf of Open UK and our headline sponsor, IEEE. IEEE SO Open came on board very early and allowed us to build this conference. And Open UK, for anyone who doesn't know it, is the UK organisation for the business of open technology. And that's open source software, open hardware, and open data. Our vision is UK leadership and global collaboration in open technology. And I know that many people have travelled far. Lots of you have come from our friends in FOSDEM last weekend to be with us today, so welcome. I'd like to pause and thank a few people. I'd like to thank in particular our sponsors. As well as IEEE SO Open, we have incredible sponsors, iSurveillance, Bristow's, UKRI, and ARM. Fantastic sponsors, GitHub, Google, and Avan. Awesome sponsors, Microsoft, Sonotype, and EPAM. Now, I want to thank them right now at the beginning of the day because all of us have benefited. Because of their sponsorship, we've been able to do this event, and we've been able to have tickets priced at $199, and many, many free tickets to allow those who are in difficult situations at the moment to bring in students, to bring in our community. So thanks to all of those sponsors. The event is being live streamed and recorded across the 6 tracks, so welcome to everybody who's joining us digitally. We also have a number of what we've called gifted sponsors, in-kind sponsors, people like ThoughtWorks who gave us office space, people like the Digital Catapult who are providing scribes for the entrepreneurship room. The State of OpenCon is not going to be like any conference you've ever been to before. We built it in 10 weeks, so I apologize now for the glitches that you'll experience along the way. We've done our best. Several hundred people, I thought it was 300, but we counted it last night. Several hundred people have contributed to the content of this event. We have 130 plus world-class speakers, each of whom has earned their place on a stage. Nobody's bought a space at this conference. Each of them have earned it through hard work and skills development. They're all subject matter experts. We have 6 tracks, which I'm sure you'll enjoy. We have an unconference, and our friends at Sustain OSS have their own conference going on within our conference. Can I note that if anybody wants to go to that, you can only access their room through lift B at the far end. We also have an entrepreneurship room, which is right next door. That entrepreneurship room is going to give unprecedented access to founders. There are 13 founders, some of them really significant companies that they've founded. We'll have founders from companies like Percona, Snick, Avan, a whole raft of companies that you should go and take advantage of meeting. And they'll be hosting 45-minute workshops followed by a roundtable conversation where you get to sit at the table and talk to the founders. As well as our content, we've got what we're calling DX, Delegate Experience. And I know some of you have been on the floors already, but we've got on the ground floors, you'll have seen our festival tents outside. Use that as somewhere to go and hang out. Use it for a coffee or your lunch. First floor, third floor, and fourth floor, you'll have seen that we have 58 tables from projects, from organizations, from foundations, from enterprises across the ecosystem, across the world. And that's your opportunity to go and hang out, to go and meet these people, to make connections and contacts and find out about what they do. Find out about where your place is and how you can contribute and take part. We also have some amazing, amazing people providing what we're calling delegate experiences. So the BBC are on the first floor with something called Finding New God, something like that, sorry. and with Griff Rees, where they have a whole experiential piece with music and vision. We've got Boeing on the 3rd floor, and Boeing have got VR headsets where you can do flight simulation and also go into space. Not many conferences offer you that, I don't think. We also have a range of amenities that I hope will make your 2 days with us more comfortable. If not, Sam and the team will be at reception and at the Open UK desk, and there's an information point on every floor. It's also quite a confusing building, so feel free to ask our volunteer community who are all wearing hoodies with State of OpenCon on the back if you need directions and things. You've seen the photo exhibition on your way in here with 38 key figures from UK open source. And it's very purposely placed to put people at the heart of the conference, because people are at the heart of everything we do at Open UK. Tech's about people. I'm really pleased to say, as an organisation, diversity and sustainability are at the heart of everything we do. They're not a separate track, they're not a side issue, they're not separate events. And Nico, are you in the room, Nico? I don't know if he's here yet. Nico Weber, I'm really proud of you. Right at the back, you stayed at the back, I told you to move forward. You can't win them all, right? So Nico was very, very impressive in getting us a Chaos Gold Medal for Diversity for our first conference, which is quite an achievement. And looking around the room, I think you'll say it's an unusual room. It's not your normal room in open source or in tech. One other thing I should have mentioned, and I forgot about the photos, is Tiana Lee. Is Tiana here? Our 25-year-old photographer is in the middle of the room. She took those amazing photos, and if anybody would like their own one, she's on the 4th floor taking portraits and headshots for people. Sustainability, I've said, is at the heart of what we do. And for us, we wanted to make sure that our conference, while we brought people together, because we know it's super important, that our conference was as sustainable as it could be. And we've worked with woodlands.co.uk, who have a table on the 1st floor, and Woodlands are planting a deciduous tree in the southeast of England for each delegate registered. And it's not a hollow promise. I give you my personal word on that. We will be following that with them. We will post on social media. You'll see your tree. I might not be able to put them against the individuals, but you'll see your tree. Building this conference in a 10-week period has been really, really hard. It's been really hard on me, and it's been really hard on my team, who I'm really grateful to. They've worked around the clock. And we've been asked why we did this. Why was it important? Well, all of the talks that you have are going to be important. The reality is that you need to be part of this conversation that's going to happen this morning if you're an open source software. What's been happening is there have been conversations in silos across the globe, and they've not been open and engaging. And what we really want to do is bring the whole community to a point of understanding where we can all have opinions and we can all contribute. So I haven't shared this really, but this is an anniversary for me. And 15 years ago tomorrow, I joined a company called Canonical. I'm assuming many of you will know Canonical. It's, or it was at the time, Europe's biggest open source company, and it's the commercial sponsor of Ubuntu. Now, when I joined Canonical, open source was really tough. And it was really tough because it was hard to get open source into enterprises and into the public sector. I was the general counsel, I was the head lawyer, and I was there for 5 years, so all the commercial deals escalated up to me. And it was tough because we had difficulty with legal, procurement, and finance. And we had difficulty getting them to understand risk or lack of risk, or the difference in what they perceived as risk from the reality of open source. Now that's changed, and it's changed in the last 10 years, primarily in the last 5. And it's changed as we've seen a shift to digitalization, which allows for services to be delivered through digital environments, which means it's software defined, and if it's software defined today, it's open source, right? So it's shifted because of digitalization, elevating the status of engineers. It's brought their status to a level where they're able to make decisions and be influencers. And what we've seen is the rise of GitHub, GitLab, and other repositories, public repositories, allowing access to that software, allowing engineers to bring it into their organizations and try it out. Now, in being able to do that, what that means is that open source projects can gain traction and adoption and ubiquity at a pace that's never been seen before. And that's got a lot to do with why we've been so successful. That, and obviously being better code and much better innovation, all the rest of it. So what is open source? Well, let's start the day by defining that. Open source in a sort of lawyer's technical definition is software where the source code is shared, that's distributed on an open source license that meets the open source definition. So it means that it's available to everybody and it's available without restriction in what you use it for. You can restrict code for commercial purposes, etc., but if you do that, it's not open source. And we've seen this shift to it in the last decade. And one thing that we've seen in all open source, because of the licensing, is that the creators, the software developers, the engineers, distribute their software without liability. Every license, as lawyers would say, disclaims liability. The liability does not sit with the creator. If you use open source software, you're responsible for how you use it. You have to think about how you implement it, how you curate it. Like anything that has a massive escalation, massive adoption, there are issues with how that's happened. And we haven't always seen practices embedded the way we should. And that's something that's going to come out in the conversation this morning, I think. But the rise of open source software, inevitably, in a digital environment, has meant that regulators, governments, policymakers start to focus on it. And what we've seen in the last couple of years is new laws. And there are some concerns with some of those about where the burden of risk might shift to. We've particularly seen in the last few weeks the open source community feeding back to the European Commission on the Cyber Resilience Act. Now, that Cyber Resilience Act has a few errors in it that are fundamental and need to be fixed. Overall, it's not problematic, but there is no such thing as commercial open source software. All open source software can be used commercially, that's the point. So there's a few things that they need to iron out so that that doesn't cause problems to open source. We've also seen some inequity. One of the beauties of open source is the collective equity that it brings. And the inequity we've seen, great example, Log4j. Everybody remembers it in 2021, security vulnerability. And what that meant was we saw two maintainers of a project which was implemented, a software that was implemented across an estimated 8 million platforms. So when we had a security vulnerability, all of the security folk in the room lost their Christmas. Now, they're going to be downstairs in the Churchill. We have a security track that is just unbelievable, and I recommend it. But that vulnerability and that 2 people versus 8 million platforms, 2 unpaid people versus 8 million people making, or organizations making money out of it in the whole, that shows you the imbalance that we have to address. And it really, really matters here in the UK. And it matters because we are a centre of excellence. We are a centre of excellence in open source software. And this is something that is just not talked about enough by any of us. All of you from the UK, you have a responsibility to spread the word. We're a centre of excellence and we are the 5th biggest contributor in the world to open source software. Now, we're not the 5th biggest country in the world, and the countries ahead of us are much, much bigger. We were hoping to push out a report this morning. It'll be out later this week. But in that, we have some information from the Octoverse report that GitHub did. And at the 31st of October last year, there were 4.8 million, they call them developer accounts in GitHub, 4.8 million developer accounts in the UK. Now, that might not be an accurate way of counting open source developers, but it's the industry standard. And it's something that we're doing in a direct comparison with other countries. We're all using the same thing. That's 4.1% of the UK population. It's massive. It's absolutely huge. There is no other country in the world that has that level per capita. We've done all the figures. The US sits at 4.07. The US's 4.07 could actually be inaccurate. They might be just ahead of us because they don't have as up-to-date population figures as we do. But as of Sunday, and you heard it here first, this has not been published anywhere, we hit 3 million, and we hit 3,003,069 GitHub accounts in the UK. So we have now more than that 4.1%. So I've talked to you a little bit about regulation and regulators. I'm not very good with bits of paper, so I'm just looking for something. And yesterday, and I don't know if many of you will have seen it, I struggled to see it because I was here building this conference. Yesterday, DCMS issued a consultation, and it's the first consultation I've seen in the UK in a very long time that calls out open source software. DCMS is speaking tomorrow in the security track, and in the afternoon they're hosting a 45-minute, is it 1.5 hours, Aaron? But it's 45 people can join a face-to-face workshop on the 4th floor. If anybody's interested, you can book it on the Shed app. And DCMS's consultation is a call for views on software resilience and security for businesses and organizations. And I'm just going to quote from it a little bit. It says, "The open source software community is an important source of innovation, with contributions bringing new ideas, flexibility and agility to the tech sector. Placing additional burden on open source software developers could restrict this innovation. Yet the open source community faces challenges in the development and maintenance of secure code, which takes time, tools and skills, and could require further support. The levels of resourcing across the open source community are often inconsistent, particularly as participation in open source development and maintenance is predominantly on a voluntary basis. It is not unusual for frequently used code components to be maintained by a single person. This means the maintainer might not have the resources to update and maintain the package properly and in a timely manner, or adequately review and quality assure code. There is also a risk of the code becoming unmaintained. Due to the broad adoption of open source software, both as standalone solutions and as components and commercial offerings, the effects of these resourcing challenges permeate digital supply chains. This can result in the introduction of vulnerabilities or prevent vulnerabilities being fixed once identified. Open source software is fundamentally a critical aspect of the software ecosystem, and the reliance on these open source components within digital supply chains is increasing. So that's the first thing I've seen in many, many years from any part of UK government talking about open source software. And I have to say that Open UK welcomes it. We welcome their considered approach and the fact that they have recognised the burden being placed on the open source community and look like they're going to legislate with care. So ladies and gentlemen, I think you've heard more than enough of me, certainly more than I planned to say. I'd like to change the tone a little bit, and I'd like to introduce our first keynote speaker. Our first keynote speaker is Labour MP for Newcastle upon Tyne and Shadow Minister for Science, Research and Technology. Chair Nwara is going to talk to us today about Labour's industrial strategy for innovation. Now, Che isn't your average MP. She's an engineer who spent 20 years in the telecoms sector before she became a Member of Parliament. She worked at Ofcom and she was head of telecoms regulation there. She also worked in a number of organisations, including Cable and Wireless. This is a politician who actually understands tech. Today, Che is still a chartered engineer with a BEng in electrical engineering from Imperial and an MBA from Manchester Business School. So it gives me great pleasure to ask you to join me in welcoming to the stage. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome Che Nwara.
Thanks so much, Amanda, for that fantastic introduction. And it is really great to be here. I am the Shadow Minister for Research, Science and Innovation, though those of you who follow British politics may be aware that our Prime Minister has decided that with all the challenges we face, now is the time to reorganise all the departments of government. So who knows what I'll be shadowing when I leave this event. But regardless, let me tell you, regardless of that, I will still remain a self-proclaimed tech evangelist. And so it is great to be in a room full of, I assume, tech advocates and, if you like, preach to the choir about the opportunities tech offers for collaboration, innovation, and the promotion of public good. Now, I'll start by just saying something which may disappoint many of you. I started off in hardware as a hardware engineer, building circuit boards, and I thought that was great, actually, you know. But I did spend 10 years developing software and applications in C++, and various proprietary languages. And when I think of the lost time in my life working on proprietary languages, my God, So, I'm so glad that's not going to be happening, I hope, to any young engineers today. But so I still think that makes me the closest thing to a developer in the House of Commons at the moment. And software has been a huge part of my life. But I will say to you, software is a huge part of everyone's lives. There's no part of the economy that is not run through or in tandem with, in some way, software. But to many, it is obscure and inaccessible. To too many of my constituents, indeed, it is threatening. They feel software is something that's not done for them, something that's done to them rather than for them or with them. They feel as though the algorithm from tech giants, is having an increasing impact on their lives, an impact that they have no power to change. So I want people to feel empowered to take control of the technology that rules their workplace and their personal lives, and often their access to government services. And I believe very strongly that open source presents us, and I'll take Amanda's definition on that, presents us with the opportunity to democratize technology, which is something I feel really passionately about, and also to foster collaboration, driving competition and innovation. And so just as one stat, Open UK has estimated that it delivers an economic boost of between 30 and 43 billion pounds to the UK. And I also say that I have a bit of form in this. When I was elected as MP back in 2010, I was the first MP to mention the Internet of Things in the House of Commons. And I was also the first MP to publish all my meetings and my casework anonymized as open data. And thank you. And actually, I back in 2011, 12, 13, I think I ran a competition. The prize was tea in the House of Commons for the best application of my data, the tagline was Open MP data. And I had to stop doing that because it was too much effort, but it was just to run the thing. But it was really interesting, what could be done. And I do think that there's so much opportunity to increase the accessibility and openness of our government and Parliament through open data. But I'm also, really concerned that over that time, like it's 13 years almost, I've been an MP, the successive governments, Conservative governments, but their legislative and policy agenda on digital, whether it be the online harms bills or AI strategy or security and resilience, it lacks ambition or it's wholly inadequate and it doesn't understand and reflect the opportunities of technology. There's a number of reasons for that, which I won't go into, but one particular reason is that I think successive Conservative governments do not see regulation as supportive of innovation. Now, regulation can be a barrier to innovation, but also regulation can support innovation. It can support particularly in many ways, but access of smaller, more agile companies to government contracts, to marketplaces. And I think the government has the wrong-headed idea that regulation is anti-growth. And I just want to say regulation can be pro-growth, and there's strong evidence that it's the lack of agile regulation that is undermining competition across many sectors of our economy, dragging down innovation and productivity. And I think that is true in open source. And we have, as a result, we have one of the lowest levels of business investment in the G7. And many of our great tech startups, are being bought up or moving abroad due to a lack of finance, which is related in part to the lack of regulatory certainty. So that's why I'm really proud to be part of, obviously, Labour's front bench, which includes our, at the moment, at any rate, we have the Department of Culture, Media, in Sport, and a colleague, and we really get the opportunities of technologies such as open source, when they're well targeted, activist regulation can be both pro-growth and pro-innovation. So good regulation creates a virtuous circle where more people trust, and I think the issues about security and resilience are critical here. More people trust and use the systems, encouraging greater investment and in turn more adoption across sectors. And just as with food or an electrical product, people have to have a basic level of trust that the products that are coming, that are being served by open source are safe, and we need to develop that. We need to build that with new technologies, with standards particularly that can be trusted and head off problems before they ever arise. And I also have a bit of form here. When I worked for a company called Nortel, developing open standards for pan-European business systems, and at Ofcom I was a real advocate for open standards for interfacing to incumbent companies like British Telecom to open up our national infrastructure to competition. So I do, I think really that there will be a driving agenda for the next Labour government to deliver what our Shadow Secretary of State, Lucy Powell, calls a new settlement for the digital age, working for the many. And as digital technologies transform our society and economy, we're going to look to open up data while drawing on world's leading regulation to ensure that it's safe and secure, and ensuring consumer rights, upskill our workers, and empower consumers and small businesses to take ownership and spread technology wealth across our country. We look to diffuse digital tech across public services. There's so much opportunity there, driving improvements, bringing services closer to people, making them more effective and efficient, alongside ensuring we have a connected Britain using 5G innovation to its full potential. So the choice is clear: unlock the power of the digital revolution in the interests of the many, or continue to benefit a smaller few. And I know on which side I feel open source is. And so to achieve this, you need a government that works in active partnership with industry and the tech sector. And under a Labour government, that's exactly what you'll get. Now, I doubt that many of you have read our fantastic industrial strategy, Prosperity Through Partnership. So I'm here to tell you just briefly about it. It sets out our sort of bold vision for the country, and it adopts what's called a mission-based approach, which the aim of achieving 4 goals. I'll just go through these quickly. Delivering clean power by 2030, harnessing data for the public good, national mission, caring for the future, and building a resilient economy. And that is about resilient supply chains, opening up procurement, and making sure that we have national security is at the heart of that. So I talked a bit about harnessing data for the public good today, but I would really encourage you, I'm really interested in your feedback as well, if you take a look at the industrial strategy and feedback what you think on it. And particularly on harnessing data for the public good. You need to use new capabilities in data analysis and artificial intelligence to deliver better public services and improve people's quality of life. That is what we're about as a party. That we're already seeing data-based technologies transforming our economy. AI is being used to prevent fraud, enable search engines, develop vaccines and medicines. And just key principle I want to leave you with, we believe that government can actively shape these technologies for the public good, such as through open source, and that they have the potential to increase productivity, deliver better public services, and improve quality of life. But equally, and that goes hand in hand with having an ethical heart to the regulation and the support for these industries. So we are already a world leader in AI ethics and safety research, and our academic researchers and software engineers are solving existing issues beginning to solve existing issues such as privacy, cybersecurity, safeguarding children, but we also are looking ahead to the future risks, like the potential for opaque, AI systems to diverge from our intended objective. So we look to lead the way in data, to be pro-innovation, the regulatory regime which ensure that the UK's data ecosystem is secure and trusted, providing certainty to businesses and delivering better outcome for consumers. We'd also look to see how we could go further to make data sets open to businesses, researchers and citizens, learning from the initiatives such as open banking. And on procurement, which I think is a huge issue, particularly for small businesses, but also for the take-up of open source. We have a 5-point procurement plan, which looks at maximizing post-Brexit opportunities to ensure all public procurement promotes the national interest, getting tough on suppliers who fail to deliver for the taxpayer, guaranteeing transparency about how taxpayers' money is spent, and overseeing the biggest wave of insourcing in a generation. We want to deliver on intelligent procurement through intelligent procurers, and also reducing on the bureaucratic burden placed on SME contractors within the bidding process, and which will tackle late payments. And I think that for the open source community, the opportunity in public service is absolutely huge. Also, as an international focus, we would work to increase the open and secure international flow of data, and to maintain Britain's data adequacy standards within the European Union, with the European Union helping UK companies do business in Europe. And I think we must be much more active in the development of standards. Again, I think standards, open standards, transparent standards, can make such a contribution to the competition, but also to the transparency and accessibility of our public services. So, it's been a real pleasure to speak to you today. It's great to be in a room full of tech advocates. Again, I was going to be different when I walk across the road into Parliament in a few minutes. I know you've got a fantastic programme. I'm not saying that I'm jealous, but hey, you've got a fantastic programme of events today. Really, our industrial strategy, the thing I'm thinking about day and night, is how we create the conditions for our emerging industries to thrive and to deliver on those great jobs, high-skilled jobs across our country. And I really believe open source has a role to play there. So our door's always open to you if you want to get in touch. And it's, again, I just end where I start. I'm a tech evangelist. I've been somewhat saddened to see technology or engineering going from being, if you like, somewhat boring, but useful. That's how people used to treat me at parties when I was to exciting but exploitative. I want to change that. I want to help deliver the real promise of digital and technology for everyone, everywhere, and I look forward to your help in doing that. Thank you.
Perfect. Thank you. So everyone, I think the prospect of unlocking the power of the digital revolution for the many and tech for good, digital public good, I think that will resonate with many of the open source community here today, the open data and open hardware communities too. Che mentioned the Online Harms Bill, which we have Wikimedia founder Jimmy Wales talking about tomorrow morning at 9:15, so I'd very much recommend being in this room tomorrow. We weren't meant to be having any plenaries tomorrow, and we've put that on specially because Jimmy didn't fit within software and wanted to speak for us, so we're really grateful for that. And I agree with Che that regulation must support innovation, and the right regulation is what we need, and it's probably light touch regulation that focuses with a deep understanding on what we all do. And that's something that I hope to engage with the Labour Party on as we talk to them more going forwards. We did invite the Digital Minister and DCMS Ministers, but they declined to attend. We have previously worked with the Conservative Party and the SNP, so we're not just giving you one message today. Our next keynote has come a long way to join you. I met him in Lake Tahoe in Nevada at a conference And it's one of the beauties of conferences. You get to see people speak and think that person is really damn hot. Damani Corbin's keynote was really damn hot. He was absolutely phenomenal. And he is from Boeing, who have very kindly brought us space today. And Damani's worked there from 2022 and set up their open source program office. Before that, Damani worked for a British startup, Weaveworks. And it gives me great pleasure to welcome him today, but also his mum's in the room and has come with them. So Damani, make your mum proud. Please welcome Damani Corbin. It's all yours.
Good morning. Good morning. We got to get the energy in the room. The energy is in the room. Welcome to the State of OpenCon 2023. What an amazing conference that we have here so far. I can't believe that it's only been 10 weeks. As Amanda said, my name is Damani Corbin, and I am leading the strategy out of the open source program office at the Boeing company. Thank you to my colleagues in the UK who came to join me. I met Amanda at this conference, and in her passive-aggressive way, I came off stage. I just finished the talk, and she grabbed me by my arm, and she says that I'm planning a little conference. Everything's not together. It's going to be in a couple of weeks, but you have to speak. You have to be here. By the time we finished speaking, she already had spoke to my boss. Everything was in motion, and she was rolling. For the past 3 weeks, I've been traveling. I've been at different conferences. I see some faces in the crowd. Kudos to you international speakers who get a chance to do it. Last week, I was at the Cloud Native Security Conference in Seattle. I see Liz Rice. I seen Colleen. I seen some familiar faces who were there, but we got to stop and say thank you to the supporting cast that allow you to do these things. So I want to say thank you to my wife. She's home with our children, ensuring that you get a chance to travel and do these things. So I want to stop and say thank you. And I want to remind you to make sure. I also wanted to remind you to stop to say thank you to the invisible roles. There's always the roles. When you see a conference like this, we forget about the sound. We forget about the lighting. We forget about the janitors. We forget about the roles that are not in the forefront. But anytime there's a production of this magnitude in general, we need to stop to make sure that we're saying thank you along the way. And that's something I want to start by saying thank you to Amanda, her amazing team, for all of the work she's done to make such a great experience over the next 2 days. So at Boeing, from the most executive role to the most starting role, they have something that we call our diversity blueprint. And what it is a one-page PowerPoint presentation where you talk about where you've been, how you've got there, you add some pictures, and then at the end of it, and you go through it with your team, or you go through it and you kind of talk about that. And it's a culture of diversity that I've seen, that I've been really impressed being at Boeing, to see that type of culture be trickled down to such a large organization. And then the last question on that diversity blueprint is, what does diversity mean to you? And on mine, I said, here's what diversity means to you, means to me. And this is something that I think that you can take for diversity, but it can also work in the software community as well. I say, invite me to the party. Teach me your dance, but then go the extra mile and learn my dance. Over time, we've realized that diversity has been a force multiplier. It's been at the heart to increase innovation by opening up the doors to underrepresented communities. In the United States, the month of February, we celebrate Black History Month, where we take the time to recognize the achievements of the African American community in the US. I know here in the UK, that's done in the month of October, but just as how we've realized what has happened in that type of community, we need to also realize that the 80-20 rule still exists. in the open source community, there's about 20% of the people doing 80% of the work. And major organizations like Boeing are utilizing a ton of open source software. And we got to realize to change the narrative a little bit to how can we do a better job at supporting the community. So that's what we've been doing here. In 2023, the White House has mentioned that it's going to be the year of open science. So I did some research to kind of really understand how that was going to play in. And what really happened when they spoke about open science was they wanted to decouple the research funding from what's happening so that we can move from the theoretical to the practical. So what was happening is that you realize that there's a bunch of hobbyists getting involved with science, and they realize that if only the folks who were getting the funding to do the research, you weren't being able to capitalize off of the inertia of just the mass majority of people that could contribute. So they kicked off this 5-year strategy of this year of open science, and people don't understand what's happening. There isn't transparency. There isn't reproducibility inside of science. So as a whole, collectively, we can't really hit those strides that we want to get to. So as I looked at the brief and I understood what was going on, I realized that data and open source software were critical pieces to science hitting that stride. Because if you don't have the data that's open, then people can't really get involved and collaborate if the data is not open. But then also, if you have only proprietary software that allows you to manipulate the data or work with it, then that's also a catch-22. So you're really not open and transparent to allowing people to use it. So you need open data and you need open source software available to really hit that stride from an open science perspective. And just open hardware. These aren't things that are being talked about today, but I'm happy that this conference is tying all these critical tracks together to ensure that we'll be able to advance collectively. At this time, I wanted to play a video. What you just saw was our high-fidelity digital twin team at Boeing changing the game in how we interact with different entities within inside of the company. That is built on Unreal Engine. It's not open source, it's open core. Open core is still open. I didn't want you guys to beat me up and so I just wanted to be clear. But what's happening there is it's really expensive to train. It's really expensive to change the way to actually get people inside of a cockpit to be able to demonstrate different products. internally. So what they did was to start creating different platforms to integrate with other teams. So when we launched the open source program office, this team reached out to us to share some of the great things that's been doing across the organization. And this is the power of really building communities. When we talk about building communities, we did a little bit of research from some of the largest organizations to realize that 1 out of every 6 developers contribute back to open source projects. So if you look at a large organization and your open source policies aren't really sustainable, then you're missing out on those engineers, those developers that are naturally probably contributing back to the communities. So when we launched our open source program office in Boeing, there was 3 things that I evangelized and things that I tried to implement. The first was, how do we make it easier for our developers to consume open source software? How do we cut down a little bit of the red tape? How do we lower some barriers? 2 is, how do we allow developers to contribute back to open source projects? What can we do to allow them to participate with inside of the communities? And then 3 is, how can we focus on inner sourcing so that we can take advantage of some of the great things that are happening internally? And those are the 3 points that I went around the organization just having conversations with different folks and focus on those 3 things. So last year, we joined the Cloud Native Computing Foundation. We also joined the ELISA Foundation, Enabling Linux and Safety Applications. But we just did not join these organizations. We also launched and got involved in the working groups, because that's really where the things happen. So within the CNCF, we were the founding member of the Transportation Working Group. Inside of ELISA, we launched the Aerospace Working Group. And hopefully we can pull on other partners that are in the space to continue to take advantage of some of the great engineering talent that you have internally. But these are some of the ways that we can be able to support the community. And lastly, before I leave, I say this: if you fail to plan, you plan to fail. I'm telling you to get your plan in place. I mentioned the year of open science. It was a 5-year strategy. A 5-year strategy that was put in place. Open source is not a fad, it's not going anywhere. What can you do to help put a strategy in place? I have 2 numbers on the board there, 525,600, what is that? 525,600 minutes. Those are the minutes in a year. Those are the minutes in a year. What are we doing this year that we can be able to pull out to be able to make an advance forward? And then I have 86,400 are the seconds in a day. Over the next 2 days, what can you do to pull out some content from this conference that you can take back to your organization so that you can be able to affect change? So before you leave here today, make sure that you guys are the change makers inside the room. So do what you can to enable change within inside of your organization. Thank you so much.
Passive aggressive. Damani, you've left your phone. Nothing passive about me. I don't think anybody's ever called me passive in any way, shape, or form before. But Damani, thank you very much. That was just as great and hot as I expected it to be. We're slightly behind time. Don't panic. We will be back on time or close to it. We're going to have a slight change in tone now. And I'm going to invite somebody to come and join me on stage. And we're going to sit over here and have a bit of a fireside chat. We also are going to have 2 roaming mics. I assume somebody's got those at the back of the room. Great, good to see. And we're going to talk for maybe 10, 15 minutes. And we're going to replicate a bar conversation we had in Austin in June. And back in June, I didn't know who this person was. And my colleague Andrew Martin was talking to them. And I jumped into a conversation and started gesticulating loudly. And thankfully, they agreed with me because it was Eric Brewer. And yeah, I know. So Eric is very modest. And when you look at his bio on our website and on Shared, you'll see a very short bio. If you look at his Wikipedia page, however, you'll see a list of accolades. He's the VP of Infrastructure at Google, and he's worked there since 2011. And he's a professor at UC Berkeley in California. He has a list of different awards, trophies, honorary doctorates that have been given to him. But I think he's probably best known for the work that he's done in operating systems and distributed computing. And he's known for formulating, I'm going to read this to get it right, he's known for formulating the CAP theorem about distributed network applications in the late 1990s, also known as Brewer's Law. So ladies and gentlemen, please welcome Eric Brewer.
What, this one? That one? Oh, that's right.
Well, great to be here.
Thanks very much for joining us, Eric. It's really good to have you here. I was going to bring a bit of paper from over there and decided not to. You've seen the questions that we talked about. We'll wing it. So when I met Eric, he was using this word that I had never heard before. And the word was curation. Well, obviously, I'd heard the word curation, but just not in the context of open source software.
That's because I made it up.
Okay, well, I bought it. I bought it, and I've been telling everybody it's the hot word in open source software since then. Now, do we start there, or do you want to go back? Maybe we should go back and look at where we've come from. So how did you get involved in open source software?
Well, Damani mentioned the CNCF, and I actually helped start that foundation. That was because I was deeply involved in Kubernetes, and we decided to make Kubernetes open source. And I'm very grateful we did. So my journey for real open source, I'd used it before, contributed some, but really started with Kubernetes and trying to make sure that was open source, including even the trademark, which was another whole story we could talk about. But that was really the purpose of the CNCF, was to have a place that held the trademark that wasn't Google, because that actually makes an extra level of open that's relatively unusual. And we needed that because Kubernetes has been a huge change, but as big as Google is not big enough by itself to cause that change. That kind of change needs a whole bunch of players and a whole bunch of people, and open source was the way to achieve that. So did lots of work on Kubernetes, many KubeCons, many all kinds of things in and outside of Google. That led eventually to me realizing sometime in my 2018 that the world depended on Kubernetes, and despite great efforts by many people, it wasn't as trustworthy as it ought to be.
Okay.
Right? And I would say that essentially about all open source. It's not as trustworthy as we actually currently trust it.
So what do you mean by that? Let's unpack that a little bit. So all open source isn't as trustworthy as we trust it.
What's happened is, open source, especially as you said in your keynote, in the last 5 years, has really exploded in its adoption and use. And there's a kind of a fundamental disconnect that I want to talk about that leads to the need for curation. And that disconnect is everyone understands that open source is free, and free software makes people vastly more productive because of all the work you don't have to do if you're reusing open source, right? But it says literally on every file pretty much, this comes as is, use at your own risk. That is the nature of the license. So that's the producer side of open source is, here's a whole bunch of fantastic free software, and you should build on it. And in fact, if you don't build on it, I would argue you cannot be a competitive company, right? You can't replicate all that stuff internally in a proprietary way. Yeah. So you have to use it. Every nation has to use it. Every government has to use it. British government uses a ton of open source. They are consumers, right? So that's the producer side, is lots of free software as is. Right? The consumer side historically was smallish software developers or companies, including Google, not so small, that were using open source and kind of understood that contract. I think what's happened in the last 5 years is a huge number of new entities are using open source with relatively little understanding of that contract. And in fact, in Log4j, you mentioned there's a whole set of things where lawyers from consumers would call up people and say, oh, you have vulnerabilities in your software. What's your plan to fix them? And I need a fix in 24 hours.
Yeah, it's something that I've really seen in the last 12 months. I've done some work with the UK public sector, and I've been interviewing people. And there's a tendency to follow my lawyer's definition, right, which is a lawyer's definition. So it's software where you've got the source code, you've got an OSI-approved license. Even that last bit can be a bit controversial, but the UK government follows it. Tick. So then you get someone to build your software. And what do they do with it? They throw it over the wall, they stick it on GitHub, they have no documents, They have no plans, they have no community, they have no contributions, they have no maintenance, they haven't thought about how they're going to keep it going. Who's going to use that, right? So you're just creating a wasteland and GitHub of software without really achieving your goals. And what we've seen with the public sector in particular is the reason they use open source, two reasons. The first is that they want to avoid vendor lock-in. Yep. But of course, they've contracted with someone to create this software for them. And when you ask what the maintenance plan is, they'll say, oh, I've got a 3-year contract. How's that open source? Mm-hmm. So you have that, and then nobody's going to touch that code because it hasn't been well curated or well managed. And what that then means is that you've wasted the money that you thought was going to create something that was being reused and recycled. So there's just this lack of detailed understanding.
So now that we have open source everywhere, as you said, open source has won, right? It's in every cloud, every important digital service, every government. It's presumably in lots of places you don't think about in electrical grids or water supplies or oil pipelines. Right? These are things we depend on, and they depend on open source. What is the transitive trust there? How do we make that work, right? So we need, in general, where we have to go is consumers open source have to understand that it's on them to fix security. That's not the way I'd like it to be, but that's literally what the contract says. So if you don't like that contract, you need some help from somewhere, right? And so really, where I came from thinking about curation is we have a fantastic supply of as-is software, and we have consumers, including governments, that need supported secure software, right? Where it's not as-is, right? You have to bridge the as-is to not as-is gap, right? And that's really the curator, so to speak, you can think of as the group that's going to take as-is software and convert it to supported software. Now, this is not a completely novel concept. This is essentially what happens with a Canonical or a Red Hat. When you get a license from them, at least for the lineage packages you use, they will provide support and security patches. The problem is that's a tiny fraction of all the open source software that people use, and you actually need curation for your Apache web server and your Log4j and your Spring Java libraries and all kinds of things. So there's this gap, which is how are we going to cause creation to exist so that we can have broad, powerful consumers that can't really even take the responsibility of doing all the patching and securing of open source, right?
And
that's a lot of work.
Immediately brings a couple of things to mind. So the first thing you were talking about is contracting, not so much for a license, but contracting for services from a Canonical, a Red Hat, a Google, a Microsoft, whoever it's going to be. So you're looking at that contract, and the difference, I think, between regulation and contract is that you can't regulate open source in certain ways. Open source developers create, they license, they distribute, it's there. But you can give them money. You can buy something from them, whether it's Red Hat, Canonical, or an individual. You can shift the risk through a contract, and you can get them to do some of that work, some of this curation for you.
Yes.
And frankly, for the UK, if we're a centre of excellence, and there's a lot of money to be made in this space, you would think that that would be driving our policy forward towards curation.
It's kind of why I'm here, because I believe curation is the only path forward. I think it's honestly an existential threat to open source. If we don't figure out how to cause a path for secure software to get to the consumers like electrical grids, right, open source will simply not be an option, right? Security is going to be a must-have requirement, so we have to make it possible to have a path that includes security without saying, oh, volunteers should do more, right? That's not the answer, right? The answer has to be something that's actually financially sustainable. And I'll give you an analogy that I think, once you hear it, might change your views a bit, which is you wouldn't expect a neighborhood to fix their own roads. You wouldn't expect a neighborhood to fix their water supply or their electrical grid, right? What these things share in common is they are all public infrastructures. And I would argue open source is a well-known public good, but it's actually at this point also a public infrastructure, because so much of the economy of the US and the UK and many other countries are indirectly built on open source, right? We cannot be as productive as we are. We would not have the rate of innovation that we actually have if we were not building on open source, right? So that is if you think of it as a public infrastructure, you say, well, of course I wouldn't just build a road and then never maintain it, right? That would be a waste. That is basically what we do with open source that is unsupported. It's built well, at least at first. If it's not supported, it will eventually degrade, right? That's what happens to all open source if it's not the new hot thing, right? And so, again, you can't ask people to just magically fix things. You can't have your lawyer call Log4j folks and say, fix it. You have to fix it quickly, right? You don't get to ask that question as a consumer. Now, if you had curated Log4j, you could tell your curator, you need to fix Log4j for me. And the curator would do that. And in fact, that happened in various cases where Log4j was indirectly used through curation.
Yeah, and I think that works in different ways, right? So you can get a provider who does it for you. You can learn the skills in-house. And one of the beauties of open source is that by contributing, you learn those skills yourself. And you can get to a stage in curation where when Log4j happened, ARM's response was 1 hour. So they knew within an hour everywhere in their infrastructure that Log4j was going to impact it, and were able to designate the response levels to that. So the curation done in the right way can take you forward dramatically. But I think, Eric, we should shift and we should ask the audience what they want to talk about. We have some more guests who've come in from the US as well, so I want to keep us roughly on time. So I'm going to say let's have 15 minutes of questions from the audience if you've got questions. So straight to the lady in the front row. Adam, up there. Okay, 3.
Thank you. For me, Dr. Nicholas Stingley, University of Basel. For me, curation, yes, but part of curation is accountability. And although we're talking about no legal liability for the creators, I think we need to have whole pipeline accountability as part of the curation, and an acceptance of a moral responsibility about what we do with data. And I mean responsibility as a privilege and an honor, not as a threat. So curation, accountability, whole pipeline, including data creators. What do you think?
I would say the main purpose of a curator is to be accountable, right? It's the opposite of as is. Right, and by definition, when you are using something from a curator, they're responsible, or at least they should be, for the whole pipeline, as you say.
Exactly.
Right, and so that is the service you're paying them for. And again, this is not a new model. I'm just broadening it and also trying to explain it in kind of a new way, which is it's bridging this gap. Right, the gap has existed for a long time. It didn't matter 5 years ago because we weren't using open source in all these critical systems. Now it matters. We have to address it. I don't see, frankly, any other solution than some form of curation. Now, it won't be a single curator. Like Google does a little bit of curation, something called Assured OSS, Red Hat, and Canonical I've mentioned. A company like a Databricks does essentially curation for their own software, which is Spark, right? So all the companies that have basically built around a certain part of the open source ecosystem, they are curators. Maintainers are welcome to be curators. You can be both the maintainer and the curator. Right, you can be the creator where you take no responsibility, none, that's not really what I mean, but you don't have no legal liability. And you can also, the same person could choose to play the curator role and say, for a different fee or a different structure, I will make custom changes for you. And lots of maintainers do this. Google pays OpenSSL maintainers, for example, to make important bug changes to OpenSSL, because that is a critical package, right? And I started a foundation called OpenSSF, which is part of the Linux Foundation, Open Source Security Foundation. The goal of this group is basically to help from the bottom up to secure critical packages, working with governments and many companies. And we were the group that hosted the last White House summit to try and address these issues after the Biden cybersecurity order. So there's lots of action going on, but we have still a long ways to go.
And I think that's the inspiration for what we're doing today, is to try and broaden the conversation and create more of a joined-up approach globally. Most of the conversation I've seen, at least so far, has been in the US, and it's really important to start to engage with that. And I think it's also important to recognize that we're not talking about maintainer responsibility changing. Nobody here in the DCMS consultation that I read out to you earlier, they definitely are not looking at changing something and putting burden on the maintainers, which would be inappropriate. There's no doubting.
That's why I try to use these as a role. Maintenance is a role, curation is a role. The same person can play both roles, but they don't have to.
So I'm going to move. There's Adam, there's a gentleman at the back, Mike Schwartz, and one over there, and that's probably going to run us out of time, and I'm going to not interrupt Eric so that we get through these, if I can.
Hi there, Adam Fowler. I'm a director of product at DataVid, but I used to do digital contact tracing. I was also the chair of the Linux Foundation Public Health TAC last year, and that kind of imploded. And the reason it kind of imploded was to do with this curation point. So I just wanted to ask if you think there's a different model that doesn't require £20,000, £60,000 membership fees for companies who directly employ open source developers, and if we could do almost a Raspberry Pi Foundation-esque model to act as a curator, and then they can sign commercial contracts, get donations, get funding from government, and then directly employ open source contributors like these Log4j guys and other packages. Do you think that could work, or am I crazy?
I think right now we're in a period where we need to try all the experiments. We need to try paying maintainers. We need to try paying foundations. Both of those we're actively trying. We created a new foundation. There's a CNCF security group that at least knows that space and could do some curation for certain things. There's companies like a Databricks that could do curation narrowly for things that they're already curating essentially in principle. There's SIs that could do curation of curation, right, because they already have the customer relationships. I think we need to try all these things, right, because it's not clear exactly, I don't think it's a single best model. So it's not cheap, right? I think people kind of focus on open source as free, but it's not free, right? It's free if it's never going to change and you never need to patch it, then maybe it's free. Good luck with that. The whole point of open source is speed up innovation. Speed up innovation, things are going to change.
Yeah,
right?
it's very frustrating.
This is very fundamental that we have to actually, one way or another, pay the piper to get maintenance done.
Yeah, we go to the person at the back of the room, but it is one thing that in all of our surveys that we do at Open UK, and I hope you'll all complete that this year, it's so frustrating that the #1 reason to use open source is cost saving. It's just the wrong reason, and it's what everybody says. So at the back of the room.
Hi there, Andy Bennett, Register Dynamics. So, this is an open source conference, so I think everyone will support me if I ask who other than the biggest customers ever really gets the support they want from a vendor. At least we're kind of upfront about our warranties on our code. And in my experience, with both open source and commercial software, simple things like security patches, the bottleneck is always right at the last end of the pipeline, actually getting it deployed to an appliance or a piece of software. And it's not about the software at that point. It's not about the technology. It's about very specific products, very specific processes and practices in that particular company that are minutely different from everywhere else.
Yep.
And so, as open source software, don't we have more of an advantage to offer like a curated marketplace of different support for different people there? Isn't it more about those procedures rather than about individual software packages?
Well, it has to be both, because to be a modern competitive company in pretty much any industry touched by software, which I would argue is almost any industry, right? You actually have to be able to deploy software relatively quickly, and most cannot, right? We're not at the point now where most companies can roll out a change in a day or even a week, right? If it takes you 3 months to make a database update, and that is not an exaggeration, you cannot respond to security vulnerabilities. You cannot, right? And if your competitors can respond in a day or a week, and you can respond in 3 months, in 5 years, you won't be the same market share, right? So this is moving this way to get to a kind of development pipeline that actually enables you to deploy changes. But I would argue that's mostly orthogonal to whether it's proprietary or open source. But you're right, open source can help with that for a variety of reasons, in particular when something comes along and there are fixes like Log4j. There were many fixes available quickly. So if you had the ability to deploy them, you're done, right? Most people did not have that ability.
Go over to Mike. And in the Open UK reporting that we did, all companies in the UK that responded that were under 3 years old said they used open source. Every single one of them. Mike.
Hi, I'm Mike Schwartz. I'm the founder of Glue, and I'm the host of the Open Source Underdogs podcast. Nice. So my problem with curation is that it means that somebody's going to pick winners and losers. And with 4 to 5 million open source packages, forget about GitHub repositories, who picks those winners and losers? So do you think it's maybe time to become more creative in creating open source licenses that require, if people are going to graze on the open source commons, maybe they need to check a box to say, I was here, so we can at least see not who the people are, but how many people are actually grazing on this commons pasture. And can we maybe creatively figure out how to tie that into the license? Do we need more innovation on the license side to maybe address this problem? So we have an algorithmic way to know what to curate.
I would start with there's two issues there. Do we have some idea of what to curate? I think we do. We have a fair number of signals, including data from GitHub on what's actually used, or Maven has tons of data, what's downloaded. Is it perfect data? No, but there's lots of data. Do I think we should explore license changes that enable curation? Probably. I don't see why not. I think, again, we're in the period we should try lots of experiments and see what works. So that is an avenue to try for sure. I think to the broader comment of winners and losers, I don't want there to be a curator, right? I don't want you to get all your stuff from Google. That's not what I'm saying at all. We're curating a small amount of stuff. Basically, we curate the stuff that we're already using internally, so we're already doing the patches. So there's no reason not to make that available, right? And we try to upstream those things, by the way, also, but that can take some time. So we'll make them available immediately, upstream them when we can. But yes, there should be lots of curators, and there should be curators of curators, right? And there should be specialist curators. I'm talking to financial services groups about them doing curation for stuff that industry shares. So it's an industry vertical curator, because it's to their mutual interest to all do that work together versus each company separately fixing the log4js that they need to fix individually. That's a waste of money. So there's lots of models here, but it should be competitive in the sense that you have many options for curation. That's the right long-term solution.
So we're going to come down here to Christian, and there's one over there. Do you want to do the one over there with they first? Yeah, okay, let them first. But just before we move on, this is the thing that when I met Eric, I was being very animated about, and it wasn't a bar. And we didn't agree entirely, but we do agree and we disagree. So Mike, I don't think the license solution is the right one. I feel very strongly about it because one of the essences of open source is that the way it's distributed, everybody is able to use it. There is no, no royalty, no license fee, no penalty to use it. And I think there is an ecosystem shift required, and that ecosystem shift, I think, will be something we talk about in the next panel session, but joined up international government funding. And we need to see that, I think, as a public-private enterprise. I'm giving away the ending of the story, I suppose, but I think we need public-private initiatives. I think we need to see companies investing in open source and doing it with governments. And I have a model of stewards who would do the work of curation, but it would be something that's also a digital public good. So we don't entirely agree, but I think we get to the same conclusion just in slightly different ways. So the lady at the back.
Not lady.
I was told it was a lady, sorry.
All right. Thomas Steenbergen, EPAM. I'm active in the Do Group and also in OpenSF. One of the problems I actually see when you talk about curation, I actually look at one step beforehand. One of the major issues when I talk to a lot of companies, even if they know the open source they use 20,000, 40,000, 100,000. So their main question is, where do I actually start? And what are the things that are critical to me? That's where they're actually struggling. If they know it, that's where they're struggling. So I would love to know your views, like, how would you recommend those companies to start?
Well, first it's worth pointing out that most companies don't actually know what they use. And if you ask them what do they use log4j, they couldn't tell you, right? And that's true even for Google. For our kind of main production stuff, we have excellent data on where we didn't really use log4j because we have our own logging systems, but had we used it much, we would have known exactly where it was and we could have quickly fixed it, and we did, right? In a whole bunch of other places, including Kubernetes or open source, we have less clarity in all the things that are used. We just don't have the same hygiene, frankly, for how things are built and monitored. And that's not atypical. Most companies, again, don't have an inventory of where something like log4j is actually running. So the first question I would say is, do you even know what you use? The second thing I would say is, do you have a reasonably good bar before you adopt a piece of open source technology? And I would say most companies don't have a bar at all, meaning that even Kubernetes, when I got into this journey, it had at the time something like 1,200, 1,500 dependencies, many of which were clearly not trustworthy. But again, someone in the community brought them in. I'm sure they had good intentions. But the bottom line is there was no bar for what should be included or not. And we actually reduced that over time to about 700 dependencies and got rid of the ones that looked the most risky, right? So that's a process you have to go through, right? And you think of some of the classic attacks, like the one that was there was a JavaScript attack that was basically a little tiny library that converted, I kid you not, milliseconds to seconds. And someone had a package for this, and that package became corrupt. Right? You shouldn't be using a package from milliseconds to seconds, right? And in general, you shouldn't be using packages that are small and unsupported from people you don't know, right? And that is widely practiced today, even in important pieces of software, right?
So we're going to go to the last question. This subject is one that we could talk about for a long time, and we will. And there is a panel session with Sarah Novotny and Eric, Sarah from Microsoft, this afternoon at 1:30 in the Government Law and Policy Room. So if anybody wants to delve into that more, we can do more of it then. Christian, last question.
Yeah, so Christian Patterson from Open Up. My question is more of a comment, really, but you can take that as a question as well. Obviously, security is really important, and you guys have been talking about curation as one of the aspects to having a more secure pipeline. But doesn't that in some ways shift the responsibility from the user or the enterprise that's using the open source? And what I mean by that is, as a company that's using any software or doing anything these days, you are responsible for the security of your operations, not the pipeline. Now, you can help the pipeline, that's for sure, but the responsibility is on you. So it feels like we're trying to shift this discussion to see how we can move that responsibility further down the pipeline. And I think the pipeline, the responsibility is always with the using enterprise, who can then take part in and help upstream.
I think it's fine to say the responsibility remains with the using enterprise. Let's just agree to that 100%. But the normal practice for all industries and all vendors is for the things you don't think you can support directly, you, by contract, get your vendors to support those things. Whether that's HR or legal services or marketing and advertising. And these companies, most companies, most governments can't handle the actual workload of patching and maintaining the open source they use. So they need to outsource that. They're still responsible if it breaks. Their liability is not going to disappear. But just like many other parts of their business, they can pay a vendor to take on that risk and liability legally, contractually, right? And they can, in fact, do other things too. Cyber insurance should be affected. If you're using curated software, your cyber insurance premium should be lower.
Christian, I'm sorry. Christian, I'm sorry. Christian, I'm sorry, we can't. We have to go to the next panel. I'm really sorry. But you can go up to 1:30 this afternoon and have this conversation at length. We will have quite an open panel this afternoon. I really have to wrap it up because we've got other guests and I'm slightly late, so I'm sorry. Eric, thank you so much for joining us. It's been a real pleasure having you. Thank you.
Great to see you again.
You want to stay? You want to stay? Great. So I really appreciate Eric doing that and taking the Q&A from the audience, and I'm looking forward to moderating him and Sarah this afternoon in the legal room. I think it's going to be a really interesting conversation. Now, we have some guests from the US and the UK joining us next, and we have a panel to wrap up this plenary session this morning. And the panel session is going to involve 3 people joining us. And the first of them is just quite an incredible guest for us to have from the US. So Camille Stewart Gloster is the Deputy National Cyber Director for Technology and Ecosystem Security for the White House. Camille leads technology, supply chain, data security, and cyber workforce and education efforts for the Office of National Cyber Director. Camille is a cyber technology and national security, I'm sorry, we've messed up the chairs. Camille is a cyber technology and national security strategist and policy leader whose career has spanned the private, public and non-profit sectors. She joined ONCD from Google, where she most recently served as Global Head of Product Security Strategy, and before that as Head of Security Policy and Election Integrity. So Camille, thank you very much for joining us. So our next guest is Mike Bracken CBE. And Mike is a founding partner of Public Digital, and he's a global digital leader. He also has a very modest CV, and he's led many wholesale transformations of large institutions in the private and public sector. He helps organisations use digital to change the way they work and solve systemic market, societal, and macroeconomic challenges. And Mike is probably best known to you as the digital director who created the UK's GDS and digital strategy around open source maybe 10, 12 years ago, and we'll delve more into that in a moment. Sorry, can you do that outside? Sorry, do you mind, excuse me, if you can have a conversation, we do it outside, thank you. And our third guest is Salem Avan. Salem is also someone who's travelled from the US, but he's from my homeland. So Salem is a Director of Policy, Strategy and Governance for the Division of the ICT in the United Nations. And his department's goal is to enable the UN Secretariat to deliver effectively on its mandate through the secure, responsible and innovative use of data, information and technology. There's so much that Salem has done. I'm going to skip to this piece though. Prior to the work he does today with the UN, he led cybersecurity at the UN. And in previous positions, he was responsible for information technology for peace operations, the largest department at the UN. And he joined peacekeeping in 1994 during the conflict in the former Yugoslavia and served in various places, including Croatia, Bosnia and Herzegovina, Iraq, Western Sahara, Sierra Leone, Eritrea, Ethiopia, and for the United Nations, as well as for organisations for security and cooperation in Europe, and then the Special Court for Sierra Leone. So I think you will agree with me that we have some quite incredible guests who've graced our first plenary sessions. I'm blown away by the fact these people were willing to come and talk to us. And I want to start thinking about the future of open source software and a joined up international response. I want to start by setting the international scene for our open source software. And Camille, if I may, I'm going to come to you. The White House has taken a leading role in open source software security from the executive order in May 2021. Now, frankly, that was the first piece of regulation that I had seen that clearly understood open source software. Can you elaborate a bit, Camille, on how that came about, the goals of the order, please?
Sure. First, thank you all for having me. I'm excited to have this conversation today. That executive order to improve the nation's cybersecurity posture came out after the SolarWinds event, right? That incident really underscored the fact that to improve the nation's cybersecurity, we needed to invest upstream in our supply chain and really understand the vulnerabilities that were inherent in the products that we were plugging into our infrastructure, and to understanding more intimately how our supply chains moved and where the vulnerabilities lied. The investments in that executive order were just the beginning, though. The White House convened a bunch of public and private stakeholders to have a conversation on open source software because we understood that the software is a key component in that supply chain. That conversation catalyzed a number of different initiatives, but the National Cyber Director, Director Chris Inglis, my boss, decided that we really needed to focus on understanding what the federal government could do to support the momentum that was happening in the open source community. So how do we understand what the role of the US federal government is in driving the industry and the ecosystem forward? So that open source software initiative pulled out a few things for us. We wanted to understand where the opportunities were. We wanted to understand where the federal government could uniquely support. So things like funding and how do we support all of the infrastructure providers that aggregate and distribute software. There are opportunities there for the federal government. But what really came out for us was that memory and safety was a key factor in security vulnerabilities. And while it is not a silver bullet, while it is not the only way that we are going to support the community, the Office of the National Cyber Director is really investing in driving down the use of memory unsafe languages. For large programs that use unsafe memory languages, migration to safe languages would drive down security vulnerabilities by up to 70%. That's a huge way to scale our impact, to be able to support the community. So we've pulled together a number of interagency partners, and we are working towards that end, in addition to supporting NIST as they do their work, as we support CISA as they promulgate things like software bill of materials, and NSA as they do their work. So we've really come together as a federal ecosystem to drive supporting the open source work, but also just supporting our infrastructure more broadly.
Thank you very much. And sort of picking up on that, I will say that Linda Cameron, who runs NCSC in the UK, was invited, but we invited her a little bit too late. It took time to get to her. And I know that she wanted to be part of this conversation for NCSC as well. And we will follow up with her afterwards, because I think there's going to be some synergies there. Mike. Hello. The UK also took a world-leading approach just a little bit earlier, 10, 12, 15 years ago now. So back when you were at the Cabinet Office, can you fill us in a bit on how that came about and the background on that?
Thank you, and thanks for the invite today. It's like an ancient history lesson now. How did it come about? By necessity, really. I mean, I think the Standish Group report, the Chaos report every year, I think in 2015 showed that IT programs, or programs which were delivered via technology, had a failure rate of 84%. It's quite modest, actually. And I think what we walked into in the UK at that time was systemic repeat failure of enterprise IT approaches, which had all manner of problems, of which security was one, cost was another, skill sets, outsourcing, risk. And our Parliament in 2011, nothing to do with me, had a report which described the supply chain for technology in government as an oligopoly, which is one stop short of a cartel. From memory, it had 80+% of contracts awarded to 7 or 8 vendors or organisations. That was the context in which you walked, frankly, using well understood, community supported, cheaper but not free technology, and in doing so bringing into the public realm hundreds of thousands of actors, whether they be developers, curators, maintainers, providers, whoever, just seemed like an obvious thing to do. And it wasn't particularly difficult, because all we had to do is signal our intent and then demonstrate that intent in meaningful ways, and we found it was like pushing at an open door.
Yeah. Now, I've been around long enough that I remember it very well, and it was a major, major shift at the time. And Salem, you and I have worked together on UN projects in open source, and I know that open source is really at the heart of a lot of what the UN does, and you're very engaged with it. Maybe you can tell us a bit about the synergies that you see coming from the open source communities and open source.
Thanks, Amanda, and it's lovely to be here. So I think that when we think about synergies, and when I think about my perspective being at the UN, we kind of have this kind of expansive role, dealing with things like, peace and security, development, international law, human rights, and dealing with that globally across 193 member states. When we really think about synergies, I think that one of the things that strikes me, and it really kind of goes back to the whole ethos of the DNA of open source, is establishing a purpose, a common purpose, establishing something. It's very synergistic to be able to say that we fundamentally, collectively believe in a certain approach, whether it be related to the climate, whether it be related to peace and security or human rights, and to establish that baseline of things that we can kind of come together around. So I think that's been something that the UN in its role is really trying to leverage, in the context, and trying to, I guess, introduce the open source community, which may exist in a technology and software infrastructure and data space, to some of the larger kind of drivers that we have. And I think that one of the kind of major synergies we find as well is around diversity. We clearly see in an organization like the UN, when you have that diversity of opinion, when you have that diversity of experience and of need, that the idea of something like open source being engaged to really try and address that and to bring that diversity together has been really synergistic and important for us. And we found that as we talk to member states, talk to the private sector, talk to the public sector and academia, we're finding that there's an enormous amount of opportunity that comes out of that.
And if we shift to think about adoption and engagement, and I've just been talking quite a lot with Eric about adoption and how that rolls out. Camille, one of the things that, we've seen this unprecedented adoption, but sometimes we hear, or people like me say, that policymakers don't understand technology enough. And I wonder how much that's been part of the issue faced for open source software, and how the White House got ahead of the curve on that, and how you plan to maintain that, to stay ahead of the curve, both internationally and at home.
Yeah, I mean, there are policymakers that understand the technology, but it has been really important for the Biden administration to really invest in making sure that the folks that are leading on these efforts come from a variety of backgrounds, from industry, that they are not just policymakers, that they are technologists and engineers, and that coming together of expertise and lived experience and industry knowledge and moving through sectors has been integral in truly understanding what the impacts are of the choices that we are making as policymakers and how we support the momentum that's happening externally in the private sector and in research, et cetera. And so that's been really, really key. And you'll see throughout the administration that focus on making sure the right mix of folks are coming into the agencies and departments throughout the executive branch. The Office of the National Cyber Director in particular, we've been very focused on that, right? We're focused on how do we evolve towards a digital ecosystem that is secure, resilient, and equitable. And to do that, we need to not only focus on stopping the bleeding of today, but think about those things in the context of the future. How do we build future resilience? And my division is really focused on how do we do that in the context of emerging technologies, but also how do we do that in the context of people? How do we invest in developing a cohort of cyber talent that is highly skilled, multidisciplinary, and diverse, such that they can meet the challenges of today and tomorrow? And we're really investing in that work through a workforce education and training strategy, but that focus on getting the right mix of people, the right level of understanding, coupled with the public-private partnership, has been the key pivot, I think, that's driving that collaboration.
So I didn't know that that was going to be your answer, but we're clearly very aligned in our thinking. And Open UK works in 3 pillars: community, legal and policy, and learning. You are the community. We have a legal and policy group which respond to legislation, but the third thing we've also identified is skills and learning and making sure that people are being taught the right skills. Now, Mike, you've already talked about ancient history and Camille's talking about the future. So since you left the Cabinet Office, since the government changed, there seems to have been a big shift. And one of the reasons I got engaged with Open UK was that I was worried that things had gone very quiet, and I wanted to make sure that we didn't fall behind Europe. Do you think that world leading position is slipping, has slipped? Where do you think we're going?
In the UK?
Yeah.
We're not so bad.
Very quiet.
I think, I'm not going to answer your question because
I did share it in advance.
Public Digital, a consultancy, we work with governments and big institutions, UN, IMF, World Bank, and governments around the world. And an old colleague of mine used to say, just because you think you're ahead, you're not winning. And I don't think Europe's ahead, frankly. I think that the bigger and more interesting movements are coming from COVID response, coming from crisis, coming from small teams empowered in small to mid-sized countries by population, but who've managed to get over their internal hierarchical problems to deliver for users. COVID's been a big help with that. What we've seen in the last 18 months is, following COVID, a big rush of money and people, quite rightly, people who know what they're doing in more positions of power around the world in governments, whether that be security software and anything else in digital. So I don't think the impetus is with countries with a Whitehall model, put it that way. Mm-hmm. And I don't think it's all good, actually, because I think that there's a sort of central point of what we see in that one of the benefits for open source tooling, open source generally, is the ability to rapidly react using things that already exist and are well understood with the communities that know how to do them. I think what I'm seeing is a rise of politicians and political actors who, in a way that they've done to those political spectrum, those outside of government, are now operating in government, where they're coming either with a single issue or a single policy they want to attend, and they've realised something quite simple, which with open software, with a small team of people, you can deliver at scale massive change without often having to deal with the whole machinery of government on which you're sitting. That is not overall a good thing. There will be some good things and some bad things come out of that trend. And I think that's one of the watchwords for the state of open, is that to what degree is the software and the communities behind them willing to play a part in some of that, sometimes without the overhead of government agencies. I think the other corollary to that is, on the other extreme, is that there are huge opportunities for the multilateral organisations, but at the end of the day, most of what they are doing, hugely distributed obviously, is, I think your IT department, your UNICC is still pretty much an enterprise play, so they don't really have open source communities at the core of their operations in meaningful ways. And that's a huge, huge opportunity.
Yeah, it's interesting. So I'm just going to come to Salem now anyway, and I know the UN is doing a lot of work in this space, trying to build and increase its presence. I was going to ask you about emerging markets, because Mike has already talked about some of the smaller countries being interesting, but you might also want to comment on what Mike's just said.
Thanks, Amanda. I think that when you look at the kind of state of open source globally, you have this, just as in all things, you have this massive diversity. We still have 47 what we call least developed countries, and they're kind of administered by the longest acronym in the UN, which is the United Nations Special Representative for least developed, landlocked, and small island development states. In fact, it's so long that they couldn't even use each of the letters, so they just used the first letter of each par. But it goes to say that we still have 47 countries that really have challenges in basic development. So I think when we think about those countries being able to use just technology, let alone open source, there are still massive challenges and massive impediments to that. There are also huge opportunities, huge desire, a huge amount of creativity, a huge amount of innovation in those countries. But what isn't there is there isn't always the legal frameworks, the policy frameworks, etc. And certainly, we talked a little bit about cyber or security or the whole idea of safeguards. The safeguards are there, so you have this movement towards digital, open source, and the previous panel talked about some of the risks associated with that. And then at the same time, you have these digitization, which improves certain things, but introduces risks that can't really be managed or legislated for. So I think those are the kinds of difficulties we're finding. The UN as an organization of 193 member states will find it difficult to find consensus on anything digital. And it's very kind of easy to think about. There's really just two camps when it comes to all things digital. You've got one very prominent member state on one camp, and you've got a couple of very prominent member states in another camp, and they kind of coalesce around those. So when we really start thinking about trying to have the UN be in that kind of multilateral space, I think it really has to be regional. It has to be partnerships around specific projects, specific activities, specific ideals or opportunities that we really want to try and achieve together. And it has to be groups of member states, and the UK is very important in that. Private sector, public sector, and academia. And if we can get to that space, then I think we can start building up the different tiers that we need to be able to use open source in a global way that's meaningful. And maybe from that, we can start building larger kind of impetus, larger coalition, larger kind of consensus across these areas.
Yeah, I agree. The shift now I'd like to make is to think about the role that open source plays in our national infrastructure. And Eric and I were just talking about, national infrastructure, national critical infrastructure. And Camille, to come back to you, we see open source with this, really critical, central role in our national infrastructure. And there are going to be a lot of important conversations to be had all over the world about the future of funding by international governments. Where does the White House see its role in this?
Yeah, the Office of the National Cyber Director in particular is focused on federal cohesion, that present and future resilience I talked about, aligning resources to aspirations. And those things I think are going to be key for how the White House mobilizes around this, right? We are going to focus on how do we support the ecosystem with the funding that's necessary, or developing those collaborations and partnerships to underscore that. We want to be informed by the community itself, right? From the moment this office was stood up, and one thing that I hope that you are seeing from the White House in general is that public-private partnerships have been really key. And not just a performative conversation, but really a collaboration on the issues, a comprehensive conversation that should lead to an understanding of where we have challenges and opportunities, where we need to grow, where we need to expand our reach. And so much of the work we do is informed up front by engaging with the community, but also a continued conversation, collaboration on how we evolve the implementation of the things that we've identified. So we look forward to engagements like this because they help continue to refine our understanding of the role that we can play, the opportunities, and the actual need for support, because not everything should be driven by government, right? How do we support a movement fostered through a community that really will drive us towards the change? And so we feel like our role in this is kind of getting that federal cohesion aligned, supporting the funding, supporting a look not only at what we need to do today, but how we apply that to future implementations of open source software. What does the next iteration look like? How are we applying it to Web3, to IoT, all of those things, the lessons that we're learning in this moment?
Salem, if I can come to you, the UN's role in all of this, where do you see that?
I think the UN's a really important convening entity. So the idea of being able to bring member states together, as well as private sector, public sector, is going to be important. I think that in legislative areas, I think we have a massive role there. I think that we do need to have one or two very strong partners to really start that process, because open source, for everybody in this room is, I think you've been dealing with it for decades potentially, but for many of the countries that we deal with, many of the member states, many of the challenges, it's really just a frontier. It's something that's new. There isn't the kind of understanding of how to adopt that or how to even enter into that area. So I think trying to bring that together, bring the necessary support elements together to help explain how that apparatus is built up. I think the UN has the ability to convene in that area and bring folks together in that. And I think that the other thing that's really important is when we think about open source and we think about the fact that we have open source software, data, and infrastructure, and that's all come into where we sit today, we have an enormous amount of open source. That open source all came from some sort of aspiration. I think you used that word. I think that one of the UN's key roles is to kind of help identify those global aspirations that we potentially could share. And I think that's really an important thing in kind of catalyzing action.
Yeah, Mike. So I know you want to comment on that, but I also want you to comment on something that we talked about before. So back in October, you spoke at our infrastructure event. And something I write about and talk about quite a lot is commercialization and business models around open source. And there was something you said, and you said there is a new business model for open source. And you talked about government and government funding as being that new business model. Now, I don't think it's a business model, but I think it's a necessity. Can you talk a bit more around that for us?
In a minute.
Mm-hmm. I know you want to come in, I know.
See, I listen to that, and that's all right, particularly the convening stuff. But we advise governments around the world, and I just sort of just want to reflect on something. So governments big institutions are great at rock collecting when you want to change something. That's great, but just go and collect a few rocks. We've got to be really careful with open source at the moment. It's beginning to sound a bit like, hey, you've done so much great stuff. You've shown you can work on critical national infrastructure. You've shown you can deliver government, say, public services at a fraction of the cost. All the things that 10, 15 years ago said were impossible. But there's still a sort of oh, but you know, you're probably inherently insecure, so it's up to you to go and collect some more rocks to demonstrate to us that you're insecure. Meanwhile, we'll continue running some really dreadful software that we've had for 25 years on our systems. And I think this movement's got to be a little more confidence to sort of face down the big institutions or face up to them and say, look, convening great, but we're not going to be judged by the same standards of whether it be security or just as an industry that the previous rent-seeking technology companies have carved up public sector to become. That's why I'm interested in Chi's comments earlier, because I'd just be really careful, because I think the opportunity is not to mimic standards that were set in the past, often unattainable for this movement, but actually to step into the imagination bit, which says this is what we could do. Now this is mature.
But what we create is de facto standards, right? Inevitably, that's what we do.
Correct. We're going to create them anyway. So I think that the business model, or not business model is a poor choice of words by me, but the sort of the commercial opportunity is that if we see, I'm talking now particularly about the public realm, if we see much of what's delivered, take this country, much of what's delivered has been given over in previous decades to essentially rent-seeking contracts where either in part or in full services are delivered by technology companies, systems integrators and operators. And there is, you can argue all day about the economic value of that, the removal of risk. But at the end of the day, the government will carry the risk for those because it always does. And yet there are vast parts of the public sector that don't even get addressed. So in this country, adult social care, there are probably 2.5 to 4 million people in that gap between mental health, social welfare and benefits. They're hard to address. And there are massive opportunities for this movement to focus not just public service delivery, because we've shown that we can do driving licenses at a fraction of the cost. That's fine. That's pretty sort of transactional. But focus on real policy direction and say, look, how can we help you deliver that to governments around the world? So, I'm one of these people who advise Macron and his tech thinkers and trying for Europe to weave a path through the sort of US model with the tech bros and the platforms and the sort of autocratic model on the other hand, and try to find a path that is uniquely European. This is not easy, right? And I certainly don't have the answers, but the point
when you say, sorry to interrupt you, but when you say uniquely European, I get frustrated because I get this stuff constantly about European values, digital sovereignty, but it's the same for everybody, right? It's not really uniquely European, it's uniquely nation state.
Well, no, I disagree with that.
Okay.
Because that's a good point, but I think what he's saying is, getting well off topic here, but is essentially nation state views of this are really of two types, where you have tech sovereignty, where you have enough tech in your system with the sort of to be able to operate, or not, or where you're actually buying it in, renting it and so on. And what he's saying is, I think what he's saying is, Europe, of course, geopolitically has scale, but actually because of the partition nature and the countries within it, the sovereign nature of the tech within individual countries adds up less than the sum of the parts. Yeah. And so how do you bring that to bear?
Okay.
But how do you bring it to bear with this sort of community behind it? By the way, that is a tricky one, so I don't know the answer to that. So I think the opportunity in front of us is to actually use open source much more as a guide path for how we deliver rapidly public policy outcomes. And I think COVID, there's we did a bit of piece of work at Public Digital, but there's a straight line analysis between COVID response and where you have multidisciplinary teams, often using open source, certainly using open standards to deliver. In fact, go to Togo, you'll find out they've had 2 goes at it with SARS and MERS. They know how to do this stuff. Other countries, including ours, comparatively are at a standstill. And so there's a massive opportunity to very quickly deliver public policy outcomes. And I think that should be the focus. And having the economic value behind that, having more people employed doing that, more people participating, and actually the massive opportunity in this country is divesting what happened in central government to local government, which has been a completely locked into 3 or 4 vendors for decades. And so these are huge opportunities. And I sort of, as a huge fan of the open source communities and movement, I just hope we don't get pulled back into justifying old models that other people couldn't attain to in other industries and have the freedom to approach that. Now, as someone who's run critical national infrastructure, I'm not sort of unaware of the importance of what's already been talked about here, but it's not an either or, it's an and.
No, I think it's a very good point. So I have no more written questions, and I just wanted to get us back on track for lunch. And what I'm going to do is just say to the panel, if you'd like to add some closing remarks, I'll let you choose who goes first, whoever's ready to jump in, if you've got any closing remarks you want to add to the conversation today.
I think we can reinvent government quite quickly in the next 3 to 5 years. And I think there's stuff happening around the world. In Portugal, the response to energy tariffs is worth looking at. It's in a distributed way. We can't see it yet as a pattern. But 20 years ago, there was a number of people more who could see open source emerging as a pattern. The idea of this conference would be beyond belief at that point. And I was one of those people.
Yeah.
I was an internet researcher before the web existed, because I'm very old. And, you know, I could see it. I can see that now, that there is an opportunity to massively, at speed and at scale, invent a new policy arrangement around provision of services and around more equitable distribution of policy. And it's this movement that has to sit at the heart of it.
Any other remarks, or are we good?
I'd love to build off of Mike's comment. I mean, I completely agree with your yes and. I think we are in a moment where government is open to, and at least the US government is positioning itself to realize the benefits of creativity, of a variety of experiences and expertise coming to bear on this problem space. And the opportunity to learn from what we are dealing with today, to get ahead of what is to come, but in a way that is true to that problem space, to that challenge, to the societal and economic factors that will change the nature of the application or implementation. Those things are all very important. And this opportunity to really look across all of the national security, economic prosperity, and human rights implications of the moves that we are making today is something that we are really keened into and excited about the opportunity to partner on. And so I'm just heartened by the level of collaboration and engagement that I am seeing across sectors, and excited about that yes and.
Thank you. Salim, anything to
Thanks,
close us
Amanda.
with?
Yeah, no, I think, you know, having spent quite a lot of time in all sorts of different places in states of post-conflict, in conflict, what kind of strikes me is that many of the things that we talk about aren't of concern to many of the member states in the world. You know, there are much more pressing, much more visceral, much more basic concerns. I also think that we have to kind of really understand whether or not we're talking about open source as a mechanism for economic growth. And I, you know, hear the word consumer a lot. I don't like that word. I don't think that's a nice word. Or whether it's something that can be used to do something that's fundamental to what we as global citizens want and need, noting that many of the issues that we face as humanity are not contained within sovereign states. Mm-hmm. They're just not. Whether we talk about simple things like data or cybersecurity, or whether we talk about complex things like peace and security and human rights, they transcend all of that. So I think that it really just becomes a question of, when I think about open source, I think that there is a lot of kind of technical aspects of it relating to, you know, the policy of it, the legalistic aspect of it, the technology of it. But there's also the fundamental core principle, or I guess the aspirational element of open source. And I think that's something that we should really reconnect to. And it has the potential to kind of really inspire change and also collective effort. And I think that's really important. So I think that's just what I wanted to end with.
Thank you. I said at the beginning of all of this, I have an anniversary tomorrow, and it's 15 years tomorrow since I joined Canonical, and I thought I knew what open source was, and I could give you the lawyer's definition and nothing more. And to be honest, it's been a continuous growth, but it took me a good 6 months to even get my head around it. So I'm going to ask you to join with me in thanking this incredible panel, closing our plenaries. I mentioned early on that we've had all these sponsors be really incredible and give us lots of money. They gave us a certain amount of money, and most of that we passed on by having cheap and free tickets for people. We do, however, have a form of lunch. because of sustainability, all of the food in the building that we are serving is vegan, and we have a very simple lunch today and tomorrow for you, and there'll be an afternoon snack as well. We also don't have a conference t-shirt, but we do have a hat of your choosing, and there is a hat shop on the 4th floor where you may get your hat. Finally, I'd like to invite you to Stephen Augustus's birthday party this evening. Happy birthday, Stephen Augustus. So we have a magician, we have a circus. Brian Bellingdorf, for anybody who didn't know, is an amazing DJ. He'll be on at 5:30. And the Electronique, Dommy Top, will be on at 7 o'clock on the 3rd floor. The magician's on the 4th, and the tents on the lawn will be somewhere to take your drinks. Please, we're going to 6 tracks now. You've got 3 floors of delegate experience. I hope you really enjoy the next 2 days, and thank you to everybody who's participated.